Jefferson runs for president in 1796.
The 1796 election marks the first official partisan election in the United States. 53-year-old Thomas Jefferson runs as a Democratic Republican against Federalist John Adams.
Jefferson is the founder of the Democratic Republican Party. And it says that government shouldn't be so federalized, that a lot of the power should go to the states. Federal government shouldn't spend too much, shouldn't tax too much. The Washingtonian Party becomes the Federalists. They were fighting for more centralized power. It's an ugly fight. Adams is cast as a puffed-up plutocrat, a would-be monarchist, an elite who's out of touch with the common people. Jefferson is attacked as an effete intellectual who's an apostate and a radical revolutionary who has no faith and is therefore immoral.
It's hard for us to imagine just how acrimonious the 1790s were. We sort of imagine people like Jefferson and Hamilton as sort of stiff. But these are human beings who had emotions, who got angry, who felt insulted, who didn't like each other. The 1790s was a moment where you really had two opposing parties form, each of whom thought that if the other group had power, the American experiment would fail.
In 1796. The winner of the election is the person who gets the most votes in the Electoral College. But unlike today, the person who comes second becomes vice president.
In theory, this is really nice. You're going to reunite the nation after an election and get people to transcend their partisan divides by working together.
But that doesn't happen.
Adams wins, Jefferson becomes his vice president. And actually, Adams makes overtures to working together, but Jefferson rebuffs.
Jefferson thought he'd been there at the beginning, and he wanted it to be the way he wanted it. He thought that he was right. He thought the Republicans are the nation. That's the way he saw it.
He's already planning for a rematch.
Rather than watch Adams and the Federalists move forward with an agenda he disagrees with, Jefferson disengages from his role as vice president.
He comes back to Monticello a lot during this time. And his mistress, Sally Hemings, has her first child, Harriet, in 1795, before Jefferson becomes vice president. And then thereafter, every 2 or 3 years, has another baby.
Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, John Adams and his Federalist cabinet receive fierce criticism and accusations of tyranny. Adams signs the Alien and Sedition Acts, which authorize the president to deport immigrants and arrest any citizens who make what he deems to be false or malicious statements about the federal government. The Democratic Republicans staunchly oppose these acts, which they believe are direct assaults to the freedom of speech guaranteed by the First Amendment. A promise to repeal these unconstitutional acts will be a tenet of Jefferson's next presidential campaign.
The 1796 election. It's an ugly fight, but the election of 1800 is even uglier.
You see the beginning of a vitriolic partisan press that is full of misinformation and half-truths and truths that are exaggerated.
I mean, Adams is accused of being a hermaphrodite.
It's widely reported by Federalists in New England that if Jefferson's elected, he's an atheist and he'll take your Bibles away.
The Federalists really believed that if Jefferson was elected, you would have a French-loving anarchist who is hostile to the Christian religion in power. He would threaten the stability of society with all his wild-eyed ideas of letting the people rule themselves.
Now, on the other side of this, Jeffersonians had been broadly hinting that if Jefferson didn't become president, the Union was gone. An experiment in Republican government would fail. Jefferson and Adams become highly polarizing and polarized figures.
Paradoxically, because of the intense animosities, you also have intense engagement. We've seen this in our most recent election. That animosity in some ways can breed engagement. Citizens are really coming out to make their will known. So both the Federalists and Jefferson realized that they need to appeal to voters. And voters need to therefore be informed or misinformed, as the case may be, so that they'll vote for the right person. And this is really important for American democracy because the voters themselves are starting to learn that they have a role to play.
And so in order to appeal to and mobilize support in Virginia, Jefferson says, in order for a republic to succeed, its citizens should be small farmers farming their own land, independent farmers.
It's this weird thing where you have a wealthy person who is a champion of supposedly the little guy, but he is seen as the person who represents the common man. He's against banks and the elites, and he wants public education for people. That kind of talk is galvanizing and makes him popular among artisans and farmers and people who recoil at the Federalists whom they see as elitists.
And the election of 1800. It's a confused and confusing election because it ends up that New York Senator Aaron Burr and Jefferson, both Republican, are tied in the Electoral College, and that means the outgoing House of Representatives, which is dominated by Federalists, has to decide the election.
And it takes Congress 36 tries to break that tie.
After 2 months of House revotes, lobbying, and backdoor dealing, Jefferson's adversary, Alexander Hamilton, writes, "In a choice of evils, let them take the least. Jefferson is, in every view, less dangerous than Burr." And so, thanks to the support of his arch rival, on February 17, 1801, Thomas Jefferson is announced as the 3rd president of the United States. In 1803, the Louisiana Territory is controlled by France and its notoriously erratic leader, Napoleon Bonaparte. Originally, Napoleon had grand plans to establish a North American empire. But around the same time he acquires Louisiana, in 1800, he begins to embroil France in battles all over Europe. By 1802, he has lost interest in North America and needs cash to fund his military campaigns in Europe. Jefferson sees an opportunity.
He also thought that one of the purposes of the American Revolution was to take the United States out of European conflict. He thought that if you could have an ocean on one side, an ocean on the other side, you could have peace. So it was about national security.
Jefferson sends a trusted dignitary to France to negotiate a sale with the volatile dictator.
The negotiations were undertaken by Robert Livingston. But Robert Livingston is aging, he's deaf, and he didn't speak French. French was the language of diplomacy at the turn of the 19th century. It was also the language of France at the turn of the 19th century, and remains so. And Jefferson's worried about this. And so he dispatches James Monroe to assist. Monroe had served in France before as a diplomat. His French was better than Livingston's. And Monroe is the luckiest diplomat in American history because he turns up virtually at the same moment Napoleon's decided to sell Louisiana to the United States.
Napoleon offers to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million, about $388 million today.
Jefferson in the 1790s, and then certainly when he was Secretary of State, had been an advocate of what was called strict construction of the Constitution. If something is not stipulated, if it's not specified in the Constitution, he said, look, you can't do it. Well, nowhere in the Constitution does it authorize the President of the United States to buy hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory just because it's a good deal.
Jefferson talked about maybe we should float the idea of a constitutional amendment to authorize it.
And his Secretary of State, his old friend James Madison, said, look, if you dither, Napoleon could change his mind. We don't have time for this. Think back to his governorship. One of the things he learned was you can't dither when you're making decisions, because if you do, disaster can happen.
So Jefferson's advisors convinced him, look, just do it.
And so presented with this opportunity, Jefferson seized it with two hands because he believed this was essential for the economic future of the United States.
And so, in October of 1803, Jefferson authorizes James Monroe to accept Napoleon's offer and effectively increases America's size by 140%.